Welcome to all of you joining the webinar on Youth, the Missing Piece in Global Security. The webinar will address the CSC theme of strengthening global peace, security, and governance. To present the webinar today, I would like to welcome Commonwealth alumnus Terri-Ann Gilbert-Roberts. Terri-Ann is a 2007 Commonwealth Scholar and a 2016 Commonwealth Academic Fellow. She is a development researcher who enjoys supporting governance partnerships between governments and young people. The knowledge and skills she has received gained as a Commonwealth alumnus has helped her to engage in political advisory roles with the governments of Canada and Jamaica. Currently, she is working in a new role as a research manager in the Economic, Youth and Sustainable Development Directorate of the Commonwealth Secretariat in Jamaica. I shall now hand over to Terri-Ann to introduce the webinar topic and share her work on the role of youth in global peace and security.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all. Thank you for that introduction, Evangeline, and thank you to everyone who has joined today's webinar. I'm very much looking forward to sharing with you about a topic that's very dear to my heart. As you will know, just last week, on the 21st of September, we celebrated the International Day of Peace, and our theme was Shaping Peace Together. And that theme, I think, causes us to think about the variety of actors who should be a part of the peace-building process. And I think there is now growing recognition that there is a special partnership role for young people in global security efforts. In fact, I think we are now more readily acknowledging the fact that they represent the missing piece, yes, pun intended, in our efforts to achieve a sustaining peace. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about today in four main parts of this presentation. First, I will give you a little bit of a context about why it's important to talk about this as a significant governance issue in the current environment. Secondly, I'll introduce some of the insights from the missing piece, or why we speak about the missing piece. Third, I'll talk about the implications of research that has been done to help us implement an agenda on youth, peace, and security. And then I'll end by highlighting some important issues which I think we have to consider going forward. As Evangeline had mentioned at various points in this presentation, I'll pause just to check in with you via poll so that I can gain some insights from your own experiences of youth and peace building in the world. So why is this topic so important? Well, we know we live in a violent world full of escalating conflict of all sorts, but that context has also coincided with the fact that we have the largest youth population in history. In fact, about half of the global population is under 30 years old. And for those of us in the Commonwealth, that proportion rises to 60%. This is important because 90% of those young people live in developing countries which are currently experiencing what we call a youth bulge. And that youth bulge has been interpreted in two main ways. First, there is hope that we can harness the productive energies of this large youth population to yield significant economic growth for countries around the world. That's what we call the demographic dividend. However, unfortunately, at the same time, there is also increased ephebiphobia. That's the fear of young people, particularly since the advent of the Arab Spring, the subsequent war in Syria, the rise of violent extremism. There has been significant academic and policy association made between large numbers of young people, particularly in the developing world, and on the other hand, violence, conflict, and democratic disruption in the world. In summary, youth are considered a threat to national security. Now, we cannot deny that young people do feature significantly in the statistics on violence and conflict. In fact, 1 in 4 young people between 15 and 29 is affected by violence and armed conflict. This is particularly so for young men who disproportionately lose their lives to violent conflict. We estimate that about 90% of direct conflict deaths are young men. In the Americas region, from where I am from, 60% of perpetrators of homicide are young men under 30 years old. And in my home country, the figure of homicide victims under 30 years old can be as high as 90%. Now, this shows us that young people are both victims and perpetrators of violence in the world, which is of serious concern. But the ephebophobia that we're seeing is also being driven by the fact that violent conflict is also costly. In 2018, it was estimated that violence cost the world 14.1 trillion US dollars. That's about 11.2% of global GDP. However, these statistics can be used to present an unfair, stereotypical view of young people. Notwithstanding the fact that they are disproportionately reflected in statistics on violent crime as both victims and perpetrators, all the research that we have shows us that the majority of young people are not involved in violence or violent crime. Therefore, the strong association between youth and violence is unfair. Now, that stereotyping is gaining even more significance in the current period of pandemic in which we find ourselves. Against the background of restrictive policies vis-a-vis lockdowns, curfews, states of emergencies, and so on, then we're seeing a reinforcing of some of the gender differentiation between young men and young women in terms of how they are treated in relation to this issue of violence. We know that many armed groups are using the pandemic, taking advantage of it to launch attacks against civilians and also to recruit young people to fight, particularly young men. At the same time, young men are significantly being affected by hard policing practices being implemented during this time when they encounter the security forces. Young women are now increasingly being affected by domestic violence and abuse, having been in effect trapped at home with their abusers and unable to connect with sources of help and support that they may have had prior to the pandemic. Generally, for young people, civic space is shrinking. Young people are no longer able to gather and organize in support of peace and the promotion of solidarity. All of those governance issues intersect with the fact that the socioeconomic opportunities for young people are also shrinking. We know that schooling has been disrupted for many young people around the world. In fact, in April 2020, 1.5 billion children in 186 countries stopped their schooling very suddenly. Similarly, the experiences of young people and employment is also of concern. In fact, based on a survey of 12,000 young people in 112 countries, the ILO has found that the impact of the pandemic on young people is systematically disproportionate because young people have been employed in the industries and the types of jobs which have been affected by the closures, restrictions, and so on. And this economic exclusion has been particularly hard on young women, younger youth, and young people in lower income countries. This is a situation of concern because, one, this context makes young people more vulnerable to recruitment into illicit economies. It could incite conflict among young people and between young people and other members of the community over inequalities and inequities in the society. But also, it could further potentially erode the increasing acceptance of young people as partners in peace and security. In fact, what this period is now reinforcing the stereotyping of young people, where jobless youth are being treated as threats to security, and youth seeking to gather peacefully are seen as reckless threats to public health. At the same time, I believe that even in this context, there is a framework based on research which can help us to refute these negative stereotypes of young people, fight ephebophobia, and support the inclusion of youth in peace building. And that is the UN's Youth, Peace, and Security Agenda, which I refer to as the missing piece. Now, what is the missing piece? In order to explain why we refer to youth as the missing piece, let me take you back to 2015. In 2015, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 2250, which for the first time cast young people as both progressive and positive protagonists in an international agenda on peace and security. They were viewed as partners and not as problems to be fixed. 2250 earmarked 5 principles of an agenda for youth, peace, and security. I call them the 4 Ps plus 1. That's participation, protection, prevention, partnerships, and disengagement and reintegration. In effect, the UN Security Council's resolution acknowledges the rights of young people to participate and have their views taken into account in decision-making, from negotiation of peace agreements to prevention of violence in communities. That they have the right to be protected from abuse and violence as a fundamental human right. It also calls for action on prevention, and in particular, supporting young people and their initiatives that promote cultures of tolerance and intercultural dialogue. Further, it calls for partnerships between young people and community actors and multilateral institutions through their governments to engage people before, during, and after conflict. And finally, it calls for significant investment in ensuring that young people who have been conscripted into conflict, maybe as armed soldiers and so on, are provided with the right education, employment opportunities that help them reintegrate into the society. And in effect, those 5 areas reflect a new agenda for how we should treat with young people, peace, and security. Importantly, the Security Council Resolution 2250 also called for the UN Secretary General to carry out a progress study on youth positive contributions to peace processes and conflict resolution. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But this new agenda for youth, peace, and security has been built upon a concept of sustaining peace, which linked hitherto separate areas of work of the UN, the work on peace building, which was within the jurisdiction of the Security Council, the work on human rights, which was the jurisdiction of the Human Rights Commission, and the work on development, which was being done by various funds and programs of the United Nations. All of these have now been brought together in a new agenda for peace and security. The agenda advances a definition or understanding of peace that pulls together notions of negative peace, that is, reduction and elimination of violent conflict, war, and abuse. That's what we traditionally understand as peace. It brings that notion together with a notion of positive peace that requires analysis of the underlying causes of violence, which might include inequality, corruption, political marginalization, and social injustice. In effect, this agenda makes a conceptual link between concepts of prosperity, security, sustainability, and equity, which I'm sure you'll all recognize are key attributes of the Sustainable Development Goals, which we are all pursuing under Agenda 2030. Let me pause here to hear a little bit from you about whether before this presentation today, you were aware of the Security Council Resolution 2250 or the global YPS agenda. I'd be grateful if you could share with me whether, one, you'd heard about both of these, 2250 and the agenda before, 2, only the Security Council Resolution 2250, 3rd, only the YPS agenda, the 5-pronged agenda, or 4, perhaps you had heard of neither of these. I'd love to hear from you.
We are currently receiving responses to the poll question, and we will bring up the responses on your screen very soon.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we can now pull up the responses. So we have 6% of our attendees have said yes, they have heard of both the 2250 and the agenda. None of the attendees have heard about the UNSCR 2250, and 11% of the attendees have heard about the YPS agenda, and 83% have not heard about neither of them.
Okay, thank you very much. And as we close those poll results, I will continue with my presentation. Can I just confirm that you're able to see my screen?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Good.
Yeah.
And so thanks a lot for sharing with me your understanding of this new agenda. And in a sense, I'm happy that maybe the majority of you haven't heard of it, because it gives me a chance to talk to you more about it and to talk about something, a progress study that I think helps us to better understand the agenda, which was initiated by 2250. So in response to the mandate from the UN Security Council, the UN Secretary General established an advisory group of 21 experts to guide the design and the implementation of an independent progress study, which was lead authored by Graham Simpson. I was very pleased to have been invited by the SG to join that group, which was special because of the diversity in age, in gender, nationality, expertise, and experiences of violence within the group, which helped to guide the kind of work that we did. And that progress study was undertaken during over a 2-year period, coinciding with some time that I spent as an academic fellow researching youth political participation in the world. After 2 years of work, the team presented to the Security Council a report which compiles the views and perspectives of young people, compiled from consultations with over 4,200 young people in 112 countries, including a survey of 339 youth peacebuilding organizations and various country case studies that had been implemented and presented to the advisory group. That final progress report was presented to the Security Council in 2018, and it was called The Missing Piece. It was a provocative title, which was aimed at shifting the thinking of member states from perspectives that saw young people as threats to encouraging them to confront the views of young people and embrace them as an important part of peace building work. The report was presented in 4 main sections, and I'll speak to each of these 4 sections in turn: tackling stereotypes, documenting youth peace work, addressing the violence of exclusion, and the recommendations for achieving a peace dividend. So the first part of the report speaks to addressing some of those generalizations and stereotypes that had been fueling the types of responses that member states had been implementing in relation to youth violence. These policies, in a sense, privileged hard security strategies and adopted narrow, one-sided approaches to the strategies for reducing youth involvement in crime and violence. The young people we spoke to and the advisory group viewed these kinds of responses as, in effect, counterproductive policy panics, because they were based on myths. The 4 main myths, which the report debunks, are that 1, a youth bulge causes violence. We found that there is no correlation between a youth bulge and violence. In effect, although many countries that are experiencing conflict have large youth populations, there are also many exceptions of countries which have large youth populations but are experiencing periods of relative peace. Secondly, it debunked the myth that young migrants, refugees, and internally displaced persons pose a threat to the societies in which they build their new homes. Third, it made a special argument to show that unemployment of young people on its own does not in fact lead young people to participate in violence or cause unemployment, but rather broader economic exclusion is at fault. And importantly, the report argued that prevention is in fact more effective than traditional hard-fisted approaches to national security. Having debunked those myths, the report goes on to a second section, which in fact documents or it offers a compelling argument as to why young people should be treated as the missing piece and we should invest in the peace building work that they do. To quote the report, it says that young people, even when they act locally, have critical contributions to make at national, regional, and global levels. Their work on peace and security is the connective tissue that bridges the silos of development, human rights, humanitarianism, and peace and security. The research showed that although young peace builders often lacked funding, the little funding that they had often led to very big impact. In fact, of the over 300 youth peace building organizations surveyed, most of them operated on far less than US $5,000 per year, and 97% of their teams were volunteers. But still, they were very effective, largely because, unlike some of their governments, they had built up trust with stakeholders at the local level and adopted inclusive approaches to mobilizing their peers and seeking to reach people that others could not. They were also involved in a variety of activities documented in the report that directly and indirectly contributed to peace building and the prevention of conflict. They used innovative tools such as the arts, sports, and new media to engage stakeholders, and they were very adaptable to changing environments, which I'm sure you'll recognize as an important skill for this current period of dealing with COVID-19. In addition, they were generally inclusive, not only in their approach to working to reduce conflicts in communities, but even in their organizational makeup. Many of these organizations were gender balanced in their organizational leadership and membership. And so this second section of the report presents a very compelling picture of a positive and effective role of young peace builders, regardless of how they're organized or at which level they worked. Having done that, the report, though, goes on to document some of the experiences that young peace builders have had, which they say also contributes to fueling conflict and encouraging violence. The report documents a form of structural and psychological violence that has been meted out to young people, which has emerged from the long-standing mistrust between young people, their governments, and members of the multilateral system like the United Nations. In fact, it documents the fact that a confluence of various forms of exclusion leads to conflict. In these 6 main areas of political exclusion, economic exclusion, education gaps, gender marginalization, injustice, and incomplete disengagement and reintegration of young combatants. The report highlights the way in which a shift is now required from approaches that marginalize youth to approaches that encourage meaningful inclusion. You'll note that these areas are very much aligned with the 4 Ps plus 1 of the Agenda for Youth, Peace and Security, which was first outlined in UN Security Council Resolution 2250. In effect, the young people argued that they were politically excluded from decision making, and therefore want to be included so that they can contribute to more effective peace building. But they have no interest in participating in corrupt, undemocratic, or oppressive systems. They want societies to work towards filling the opportunity gap for them in terms of employment, but they want the conversation to go beyond just jobs, to address broader economic empowerment of youth, including their participation in decision-making around economic development strategies in their countries. They want access to education, including those forms of education that promote peace and unity and solidarity. They speak to the need for young people to take a leadership role in the gendered peace work that in some ways has marginalized young women to be seen as just victims of violence and young men to be characterized as the perpetrators of violence, which does not help to allow them to do the kind of work they want to do around cultivating nonviolent masculinities and addressing the experiences of sexual and gendered minorities. They speak to the protection of peace workers and activists from victimization, including victimization from their own states, that this experience of victimization is an injustice and a breach of their human rights. And they speak to the fact that not enough has been done to help young people who were previously conscripted into conflicts and armed conflicts, to support them to properly reintegrate into their societies. This section of the report is a particularly difficult one to read and to explore, but it gives us hope because it points us in a direction which suggests that if we systematically address the violence of exclusion in all of these forms, that's the best way of preventing violence, including violent extremism, and building a sustaining peace for the world. The report concludes by giving some specific recommendations about what can be done to use this potential for demographic dividend, use these large youth populations of effective youth peace builders to reap a peace dividend for countries and for the world. And the report argues that, in essence, three things are required. 1, investment, 2, inclusion, and 3, partnership. Some of the specific recommendations in relation to investment in youth capacity include the allocation of $1.8 billion US by the year 2025. That's about $1 US per young person between 10 and 24 years old in 2018. To allocate that $1.8 billion fund to initiatives that are led by young people and that are effective in supporting conflict resolution and the prevention of violence in society. It makes recommendations for adopting flexible forms of funding or innovative funding tools that will enable us to support organizations irrespective of their organizational makeup or registration status. On the second point of transforming systems of exclusion into systems of inclusion, the report speaks to, for example, adopting quotas to ensure youth participation, to establishing youth advisory boards and facilitating the access of young people to elected positions. Protecting their rights to organize, express their opinions, participate, and access justice is a key recommendation of the report, which you'll recognize in the context of shrinking civic space is particularly important during this period of the pandemic. On the matter of partnerships, the report speaks to mandatory consultation with youth on all policies that impact their lives, the creation of new mechanisms for dialogue and accountability, which might include coalitions of organizations, networks which allow youth peace builders to connect and share information, and the continued integration of research and data collection into the efforts to develop more effective strategies. So that is the report entitled The Missing Piece, the findings that were presented to the Security Council and the recommendations made. The report was accepted in 2018, but what has happened since then? So here I'll talk a little bit about how the Youth, Peace and Security agenda, informed by the work of the Global Progress Study, is now being implemented. Well, since 2018, the UN Security Council has adopted 2 more resolutions on youth, peace and security, each of them making progressively more demanding commitments on youth participation and calling for accountability for implementation of the agenda. And the UN Secretary General has also presented his first report providing an update on the implementation of the agenda. In brief, let me tell you that UN Security Council Resolution 2419, which was adopted in 2018, is important because it was a resolution that spoke specifically to protecting and recognizing the role that young people can play in negotiating and implementing formal peace agreements. It also was a resolution that called on the Secretary General to deliver a report no later than May 2020 on what has been done. In March of this year, the Secretary General did submit his report on the 5th anniversary of the adoption of Resolution 2250. And it's a report that is both encouraging and in some ways discouraging. It's encouraging because his report outlines that there has been progress in the 5 areas of the Youth, Peace and Security agenda on the 4Ps+1, including increasing recognition of the important and effective role of young people. However, it also documents some of the structural barriers that remain that affect young people playing that positive role. The report speaks to the 5 areas of the YPS agenda: participation, protection, prevention, partnerships, disengagement, and reintegration. I'll mention a few of the comments made by the Secretary General here. In relation to participation, the Secretary General notes that political inclusion of young people continues to lag behind. Only about 2.2% of the world's parliamentarians are under 30 years old, and only 0.9% of those parliamentarians are young women under 30. And this means that generally young people are not being welcomed into formal political decision making. He found that, especially for young women, young people are unwelcome in some formal processes. And this was something he flagged as an issue of major concern. Unfortunately and interestingly, he also noted the fact that they had, in his review, he had documented the fact that the presence of young people at the negotiation table has not always resulted in having youth concerns addressed. In fact, in some cases, informal and digital activism, demonstrations, and campaigns are more effective than being around the table. He notes, for example, the initiative to use social media by the South Sudan Civil Society Forum, who launched their hashtag Sudan is Watching campaign to enable them to enact their role as observers to the South Sudan High-Level Revitalization Forum. They were much better able to engage and mobilize young people on social media, having not been able to access the formal process. In relation to protection, the report highlights and raises the concern about the harassment of young activists and young peace builders who have had their freedoms limited. Some have been detained over time. And as you can imagine, during this period of pandemic, that concern increases significantly. In the context of COVID too, this is the period in which the Secretary General is presenting this report. He notes that there is concern about the ability of member states to guarantee access to education, guarantee economic inclusion for young people because of what's happening in the world. And as we had mentioned before, not achieving these forms of inclusion could set back the progress we've made on peace and security. At the same time, the world is making some progress on the partnerships, developing new coalitions and partnerships for youth, peace, and security. He mentions, in fact, the impressive institutionalization process being undertaken by the African Union. The African Union now has annual open sessions in its Peace and Security Council. It has appointed 5 African youth ambassadors for peace, and it continues to commission new research to keep up to date the documentation and the contribution that young peace builders make as a means of building the evidence base for continued investment. There is still a lot of work to be done on disengagement and reintegration, including involving more young women in those strategies going forward. So the report is both encouraging and discouraging, and it includes many specific examples of the strengths of what we have done and some of the shortcomings that remain to be addressed. Following his report, the Security Council adopted Resolution 2535 this year, which addressed many of the issues that the Secretary General mentioned in his report. And importantly, I'll mention here, this new resolution calls specifically for the protection of youth civic spaces for young people to organize. It acknowledges the potential for the rights of young people to be breached during this COVID-19 pandemic. And importantly, it has required that the UN now coordinate, track, and report on the YPS agenda. In fact, it has institutionalized a 2-year reporting requirement on the youth, peace, and security agenda. And this is positive because we now can expect from the Secretary General every 2 years a report on the progress being made. Many of the specific examples that the Secretary General gives cover work at local, national, regional, and international levels. I want to give you 3 examples of some of the initiatives that have come out of this new agenda. These are initiatives that are being led at local, regional, and global levels. I begin first with the Global Coalition on Youth, Peace and Security, which was formed in 2019 and provides a platform for over 70 organizations representing civil society, youth-led organizations, UN entities, academia, intergovernmental organizations. It brings them all together to work on exchanging information, coordinating action, and collaborating on global policy and practice. What's interesting and important about this coalition is that in itself, it reflects a model for partnership. It is co-chaired by a youth-led peace-building organization, the UN Network of Young Peace Builders, an NGO, Search for Common Ground, and the United Nations representing member states through the Peace-Building Support Office and the United Nations Population Fund. And these organizations continue to work together to advance innovations on youth peace and security. The second example I want to share with you is the Youth 360 approach being piloted by Search for Common Ground. It's an approach which seeks to change the way that the international community works with young people. Rather than a piecemeal approach that offers perhaps short-term support to young people, this attempts to offer holistic support to youth peace builders by, one, supporting their capacity building through a mentorship program, training workshops, etc. 2, providing opportunities for young peace builders to network and exchange lessons and good practice. And 3, providing small grant funding for youth organizations to implement their activities, irrespective of their formal or informal status. And this approach is being piloted now in Sri Lanka in order to support young women peace builders in 4 communities. Finally, I'll mention the Commonwealth Youth Peace Ambassadors Network. The Commonwealth Secretariat serves as a part of the Global Coalition, but also wants to support young people connecting to share their experiences and to be able to upscale their grassroots level activities to national, regional, and pan-Commonwealth efforts in an effort to promote peace, respect, understanding, and preventing violent extremism. This network is interesting because of its diverse membership. It includes artists, tech entrepreneurs, civil society leaders, youth workers, filmmakers, cartoonists, students, and innovators of all kinds who consider themselves to be activists for peace and who are fighting against violent extremism. So it gives us an idea of the variety of actors, of young people who are working hard to promote peace and solidarity. Here, let me pause again before we conclude this presentation to find out from you about whether in your home country you find that there are opportunities for young people to be involved in peace building. I'd love to have your answer to this poll.
Let's give it a few more seconds for the responses. I would also be interested in knowing how, if you have any questions or any thoughts about such opportunities in your home countries, you can just type these thoughts in the questions or ask your queries in the questions section as well to address in the question and answer session after the presentation. Okay, seems like we have received our votes and I'm about to pull out the responses on the screen. Okay, so it seems like 18% of our attendees have had many opportunities, and 18% are not sure of these opportunities. 24% have had some opportunities. As I mentioned, I would be interested in knowing about these opportunities and hearing more from you. So do type this in the questions section. It seems the majority, that is 41% of our attendees, have had few or rare opportunities for youth involvement in peace building.
Okay, thank you very much. So we've had, as it is, as is expected, there's a diversity of experience across the world. I'm glad to hear, though, that there are some who have identified opportunities for participation of young people and allowing young people to lead on peace building activities. But of course, as your poll indicates, there's much more that needs to be done. So what's next? Well, for me, I want to talk to you about 4 or 5 main things that I think we have to pay attention to as we move forward with this agenda. There's more we can do individually and collectively to advocate for change and to create spaces for inclusion and capacity building for young people. Importantly, I think that we need to advocate for peace building work to be seen as essential in this time of COVID, and therefore that any legitimate attempts by young people to convene where those efforts respect the relevant public health protocols, those efforts should be respected and encouraged, because it's important that during this pandemic period, we give space for activities that will minimize conflict in light of the rising frustrations around lost access to education, lost jobs, and economic exclusion. Secondly, I think we need to support more work at the local level. I mentioned some of the initiatives at the global level and the pan-Commonwealth level, but there's so much that young people do effectively at very local levels, as they continue to do in terms of providing community services during the COVID pandemic. We find that young people are innovative and adaptive in the spaces in which they're closest to. And I think we need to find ways to support the localization of the agenda, which will include building the capacity of youth organizations for advocacy, for implementation, for negotiation, for lobbying, and importantly, to put the financing behind these youth initiatives at the local level. Sometimes a small group of young people who have formed a youth club and so on are not necessarily registered like an NGO, but are doing effective work that requires financial support. We all know that youth is a transitional period, and so it's important that we pay attention to the sustainability and continuity of the youth peace building work that has already been documented as being effective. How do we ensure that we continue to support successive generations while also harnessing the skills of those who are transitioning out of youthhood? I think there's attention that needs to be paid to that kind of partnership between young people emerging into leadership roles and other leaders, youth peace builders who are transitioning out of youthhood. And finally, I think we need to pay more attention, as the Secretary General's report has told us, to the work that young women do in relation to supporting peace. We already know that research has shown us that peace processes which have included women have tended to be much more sustainable. And so therefore we need to find ways and initiatives to support young women going forward. These are just a few of my ideas. In summary, we need to make significant changes to the way we work. But to quote the report, The Missing Piece, if the right investments are made in young people and their peace building work is recognized and nurtured, our societies may be able to reap a peace dividend. And that's all I have to share with you today. I hope that based on this presentation, you'll want to learn more about the Youth Peace and Security Agenda. And I'd invite you to visit youthpeace.info to learn more about the agenda and to build your own skills for advocacy on this issue. I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to hearing from you in the discussion segment about your own thoughts and views on what needs to be done to advance the global agenda on youth, peace, and security. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Terri-Ann. I'd like to request all our attendees to just type in your questions for our speaker, Terri-Ann, and we still have a few more minutes to go before we end the webinar. So do ask your questions and share your thoughts as well, share your experiences about your own home country and your work if you're working in this sector. Meanwhile, I do have a few questions that have come in, and so I'm just going to turn on my camera and hi, Terri-Ann. Just ask a few questions to the speaker. So, Terri-Ann, just intrigued to know, how did you get involved in working with youth and governance in the sector of youth and governance, and what inspired you to, get yourself involved in this? Also, if you could share your pre and post Commonwealth scholarship experience of working in the sector and how that motivated you to, pursue this further.
Okay, thank you very much. That's a great question. Well, in fact, my work around youth participation and youth in governance has really come about largely because of the Commonwealth in a very interesting way. My work has always been intertwined with the Commonwealth. As a young person, when I was leaving high school, I had been a youth volunteer working with young people in all sorts of initiatives. But I applied to become a youth ambassador for my country, for Jamaica. That's where I'm from. And in applying, I was successful and I became a youth ambassador. And one of my first assignments was to represent Jamaican youth at the Commonwealth Youth Forum in Australia. And it was there that I began to experience a situation. At that time, the Commonwealth Youth Forum was the only forum that allowed young people to discuss the important issues of the day and to share their perspectives with heads of government. And it was the first time that I realized that as young people, we could participate, we could have our views heard, and we could contribute to decision making and policy making. And so I got very excited about it, and it's been a part of my work since. Even as a Commonwealth Scholar, when I was conducting my PhD, which looked at governance in the context of regional organizations, I spent a lot of time thinking about the way in which civil society groups, including young people, can participate in building regional governance systems. And it has continued into my fellowship and my academic experience. It's been a theme that I continue to research, because I believe when you have the majority of the population, 60% of our global population under 30 years old, their views and perspectives are critical for moving us forward. And so my experience as a Commonwealth Scholar, as a representative to the Commonwealth Youth Forum, a Commonwealth Scholar, a Commonwealth Fellow, and then now today, an employee of the Commonwealth Secretariat working on youth issues, has really helped me to distill and support innovative strategies and spaces for young people's voices to be heard.
Amazing. It's so inspiring to, just hear about your experience, and just to know, how in a way it is a full circle of being a Commonwealth representative. And I'm sure, our attendees and, even when we share this recording in our Knowledge Hubs, it does inspire our Knowledge Hub members. It inspires our entire Commonwealth community, our scholars and alumni as well. Thank you so much for sharing your journey with us. We have another question. So the question is, are there any examples of projects or programs which have successfully included youth and helped to break down barriers and perceptions? So you did mention about advisory boards, but are there any others?
Oh yes, that's such an excellent question. And I'm so glad for it, because to be honest, there are so many. And I think this is what, as a youth advocate and an advocate for young people, I perhaps should not have been surprised. But when we did the progress study, the diversity of effective strategies is what surprised me. So in addition to the formation of advisory boards at global or national level, which are also effective in some instances in getting youth views to the table on negotiating peace, there were so many activities that were documented in countries, even in the region where I'm from, where young people use sports sporting activities like a football tournament to bring people together who are from warring communities to engage in an activity that builds understanding. People get to know each other. We had examples of young people in Sri Lanka using the arts and using drama to put on skits in the community that told the story of a conflict and how the conflict could be resolved. We've had young people do a lot of interesting things online to address inequalities in their communities, to raise funds for people who can't access education or can't access digital resources and so on. All of those things we found were, although people may not recognize them as traditional peace building work, were in fact building social cohesion in communities, resolving conflicts where sometimes young people had embraced historical conflicts that they had inherited from parents and grandparents. And when we spoke to young people, some of them didn't know how the conflict started or why they didn't get along with this group of people. And so being able to provide spaces led by young people, their own peers, we found that there were many, many examples. And if you visit youthforpeace.info, you can actually get access to all the data, including the case studies, so that you can find out more about some very specific examples if you want to dig into those a little bit more.
Amazing. Thank you so much about that. And we do have another, I think we have time for one more question. So the question is by Moez Rehman. And he says, the point of disengagement and reintegration is an interesting one. However, during my MA dissertation research, I found that DR programs are seen by local communities towards DR. Sorry about that. I just missed this line over there. Oh, okay. However, during my MA dissertation research, I found that DR programs are seen by local communities as a reward to former combatants. So the locals don't really feel happy about the DR programs as they have lived in the same conditions as former combatants, but never turned towards using violence or taking arms in their hands. How, in your opinion, can these issues of lack of acceptance by local communities towards DR programs for former combatants, etc., can be addressed? So DR is disengagement and reintegration programs.
Yes. That's such a great question, Maurice. And I'm so glad to hear about your research on this topic, which is a critical one. And the findings of your research are important for us to acknowledge because it is true that there can be a level of mistrust between people when they see perhaps people gaining access to opportunities that they themselves don't have access to. And you can see that perhaps as some people may see that as some sort of reward for quote unquote bad behavior. However, the point that we make in the missing piece is that we need to equitably resolve the problem of the violence of exclusion. And so we find that programs need to, one, they need to be designed, DRR programs need to be designed by, with, and for the people within the community, including the young people themselves who are a part of that community. And two, it needs to be done in an equitable fashion. So it is not just about disengaging former combatants and reintegrating them into society by providing them with access to the best education, but leaving everyone else behind. The idea is that in the spirit of inclusion and partnership, we need to bring everybody together in an integrated approach to providing access, equitable and comprehensive access to proper, good, quality education. And so the issue that your research highlights importantly is this issue of strategies being inclusive and equitable. A partial process of reintegrating one group of people without addressing the needs of others is going to do more to fuel conflict than resolve it.
That is such a great point, and it just goes on to say how everyone, all age groups, no matter the age groups, no matter religion, everyone needs to work hand in hand to just resolve the conflicts within our own communities. Thank you so much, Terri-Ann, for responding to these questions. We do have a few more questions, but we are falling short on time. So what I will do is I will post these questions when I share the recording in the Knowledge Hub. But we are going to make do with the questions for now. I'm just going to end the webinar. So once again, thank you everyone for joining us today. And a massive thanks to Terri-Ann for showcasing her work on the Independent Progress Study Report on Youth, Peace and Security. I hope everyone has enjoyed this webinar and has found the webinar insightful. And thank you, Terri-Ann, for just sharing your thoughts on involving youth as global ambassadors to work in youth and security and governance. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much, and thanks to everyone who joined.